After my husband's funeral, my son kicked me out of the house he never paid for. The words hung in the cold, damp air, each one a tiny, sharp icicle. "Mom, you should go. We need the house." My own son's words. My Michael. I stood on the porch of the house I'd lived in for 40 years. The house my late husband, Richard, and I had built from nothing. Just a week after we buried him, I was standing here. The air smelled of wet leaves and betrayal. My hand, wrinkled and spotted with age, gripped the handle of a vintage Samsonite suitcase. It was the same one Richard and I had taken on our honeymoon, filled with dreams and cheap souvenirs. Now, it was filled with the hastily packed remnants of my life. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I looked at Michael. He was my boy, but the man standing in the doorway was a stranger. His shoulders were hunched inside a jacket that was too thin for the biting autumn wind. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on the dark, wet wood of the porch steps, as if they held the answers to a question he was too afraid to ask. His knuckles were bone white, where he clenched a shiny new set of keys. Keys I had never seen before. Behind him, framed in the warm yellow light of the entryway, stood his wife, Sarah. She wasn't pretending to look away. She was watching me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't smiling, not exactly, but there was a small, satisfied curl to her lips. It was the look of someone who had just won a long, tiresome game. I was the final piece being removed from the board. A cold drizzle began to fall, a miserable, persistent mist that clung to everything. It spotted the lenses of my glasses, blurring Sarah's triumphant face into a watercolor smudge. It beaded on the worn leather of my suitcase. I felt a single cold drop trace a path down my cheek, mingling with the tear I refused to let fall. My throat was tight, a knot of grief and disbelief. What was there to say? What could I possibly say to the new, gleaming brass lock on my own front door? It was so different from the old one, the one Richard had installed himself, the one whose familiar click had welcomed me home for 4 decades. This one was cold, impersonal, and final. I thought of all the things I could scream. I could ask him how he could do this, how he could stand there and throw his own mother out into the rain just days after his father's funeral. I could ask him what happened to the boy I raised, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and promised to always take care of me. I could have thrown the suitcase at the door, made a scene, called the neighbors. But my voice was gone, stolen by the shock. My strength had been buried with Richard. All I could do was stand there, a 68-year-old woman with a single suitcase, and look at the life that was being locked away from me. I saw the porch swing where Richard and I used to sit on summer evenings, listening to the cicadas. Sarah had replaced the faded floral cushions with sterile gray ones. I saw the rose bushes by the steps, their last few blooms drooping in the rain. Richard had planted them for me on our 10th anniversary. I wondered if Sarah would rip them out to plant something more modern. I finally looked away from the house, from the memories, and back at my son. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching near his ear. He looked miserable. He looked weak. And in that moment, a sliver of anger, hot and sharp, cut through my shock. It wasn't just Sarah. It was him. He was letting this happen. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. Not yet. The tears could wait. They would have plenty of time later, in whatever lonely room I ended up in. I just gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of surrender that felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside. I turned around. My feet felt like they were encased in lead. I forced myself to take one step, then another, down the familiar brick path. Each crack in the pavement was a memory. Michael learning to ride his bike and falling right there. Richard carrying me over the threshold on our wedding day. The countless trips bringing in groceries, laughing and complaining about the wait. I reached the end of the path and stood on the sidewalk. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through my thin coat. I could feel its cold fingers on my scalp. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back, I knew I would shatter into a million pieces right there on the curb. I just stood there, listening. I waited for the sound of the door opening again. I waited to hear my son's voice calling out, "Mom, wait! I'm sorry, come back!" But the only sound that came was a solid final thud. The sound of the new lock engaging. The sound of my life being shut away forever. The silence was the worst part. In the days following Richard's funeral, it settled over the house like a thick blanket of dust, muffling every sound, amplifying every unspoken thought. It was a heavy, watchful silence, completely different from the peaceful quiet I had shared with my husband for 40 years. This was the silence of a brewing storm. This was just 3 days before my son, Michael, stood in the doorway and threw me out. That morning, I tried to pretend things were normal. I went into the kitchen, my kitchen, and performed the ritual I'd done every day for decades. I filled my favorite ceramic teapot, the blue one with a tiny chip on the spout that Richard always said gave it character. The familiar weight of it in my hands was one of the few comforting things left. As the water heated, I stared out the window at the gray, unforgiving sky. With the tea tray in hand, I walked into the living room. Weak, watery sunlight struggled through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On the coffee table, a large bouquet of white lilies from the funeral was starting to wilt, their proud heads bowing, the edges of their petals turning a sad, papery brown. The scent of their decay filled the room. Michael was there, hidden behind the wall of the morning newspaper. Sarah was curled up on the armchair, the one Richard used to sit in, her face lit by the cold, blue glow of her phone. Her thumb moved in a relentless, rhythmic swipe across the screen. Neither of them looked up when I entered. It felt like walking into a room of strangers who happened to be wearing my family's faces. "I made tea," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The newspaper rustled. Michael cleared his throat. "Thanks, Mom," he said from behind the page. His voice was muffled, distant. He asked a question without looking at me, his eyes still fixed on the print. "How are you holding up? Did you get any sleep?" The question was a pebble tossed into a frozen lake. It was the right thing to ask. The words of a caring son, but they were hollow. There was no warmth, no genuine concern. It was a line read from a script. Before I could even form an answer, Sarah spoke up, her voice syrupy sweet, not looking up from her phone. "Oh, Eleanor, you shouldn't be worrying about things like making tea. You just rest. Michael and I will handle everything around the house now." Eleanor. She called me Eleanor, not Mom. It was a small thing, a tiny shift, but it felt like a deliberate push, a redrawing of the lines in our family. She said, "We'll handle everything." But what I heard was, "This isn't your job anymore. This isn't your house anymore." I forced a smile onto my face. It felt brittle, like it might crack. "It's no trouble, dear. I like doing it." I poured a cup and placed it on the small table beside Michael's chair. He just nodded, his attention never leaving the newspaper. It was like a shield he was holding up against me. I sat on the sofa, clutching my own warm mug. The silence descended again, broken only by the faint, rhythmic swish of Sarah's thumb on her phone and the crinkle of Michael turning a page. I looked up at the mantel, at the large wedding photograph of Richard and me. We were so young, laughing into the camera, his arm wrapped securely around my waist. He had a look of pure, unguarded joy on his face. He had always been able to make me laugh. Looking at that photo, a wave of profound loneliness washed over me, so sharp it almost took my breath away. Richard was gone, and in his place were these two silent, distant people. My son, who was hiding from me, and my daughter-in-law, who looked at me with an unreadable coolness in her eyes whenever she thought I wasn't watching. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something was wrong. This wasn't just grief. Grief was a shared weight. This was something else. This was a secret, an unspoken agenda that hovered in the air between us. I took a sip of my tea, but it couldn't warm the cold dread that was slowly spreading through my veins. The wilting lilies seemed to mock me from the coffee table. Their time was over, and a terrifying, sinking feeling told me that mine was too. The afternoon light was weak and gray, doing little to warm the living room. I was folding laundry on the sofa, the scent of fresh linen, a small ordinary comfort in a house that no longer felt like my own. I was trying to create a sense of purpose, to hold on to the simple routines that had structured my life for so long. It was a losing battle. The front door opened and closed, and I looked up to see Sarah walking in. She was not alone. A woman I'd never seen before, dressed in a sharp blazer and carrying a large portfolio, followed her in. The woman's eyes swept across the room, analytical and critical, as if she were assessing a patient for signs of a terminal illness. "Eleanor," Sarah said, her voice bright and businesslike. "This is Catherine. She's an interior decorator. She's going to help us freshen things up around here." Freshen things up. The word sounded like a threat. I glanced over at the corner of the room, where Michael was sitting at a small desk, his back mostly to us. He was staring intently at his laptop screen, his shoulders hunched. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the introduction. He was trying to make himself invisible, a ghost in his own family's drama. I gave the decorator a tight, polite nod. "It's nice to meet you." Catherine, the decorator, walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Sarah followed, a clipboard in her hand. They began to murmur to each other, pointing at the curtains, the rug, the wallpaper. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I was an intruder, listening in on the plans for a life that didn't include me. I went back to folding, my movements stiff and robotic. Then Sarah's voice cut through the air, clear and decisive. "And this," she said, gesturing towards the corner by the fireplace. "This can definitely go." I followed her gesture, my breath caught in my throat. She was pointing at Richard's rocking chair. It wasn't just a chair. It was a landmark of our life together. It was made of dark, solid oak, the wood worn smooth and shiny over the years from the touch of our hands. It was where Richard sat every single evening to read the paper. It was where he rocked Michael to sleep as a baby, humming off-key lullabies. It was where I sat, wrapped in a blanket, on the night he passed away, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. The chair held 40 years of our history in its very grain. "What do you mean, go?" I asked it, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah turned to me, her smile patient, as if explaining something to a child. "We're just going to move it to storage, Eleanor. It's a bit old-fashioned, don't you think? It doesn't really fit the clean, modern aesthetic we're going for." "Old-fashioned?" I repeated, standing up. The laundry tumbled from my lap onto the floor. "Richard loved that chair." "I know, and that's sweet," she said, her tone dismissive. "But times change. We need to look to the future." She turned back to the decorator. "We can replace it with a nice, minimalist armchair, something in a light gray, perhaps." My eyes shot to Michael. This was it. This was the moment. He had to say something. He had to defend his father's memory, our memory. I stared at the back of his head, willing him to turn around, to speak up, to be my son. Please, Michael, say something. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sounds were the soft rustle of Catherine's notepad and the distant hum of traffic. Michael didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just kept staring at the bright screen of his laptop as if it held the secrets to the universe, while behind him, his wife was casually dismantling our past. His silence was louder than any argument. It was an answer. It was a betrayal. It told me everything I needed to know. He had made his choice. He had chosen his wife, his future, this clean, modern aesthetic, over me and everything Richard and I had built. A sharp, stinging pain, different from grief, lanced through my chest. It was the pain of being erased. Catherine, the decorator, must have sensed the tension. She cleared her throat. "Well, the bones of the room are good," she said, her voice professionally cheerful. "Great natural light. We have a lot to work with." Sarah smiled, pleased. "I thought so too," she said. And the two of them moved towards the window, discussing paint swatches and fabric samples. The conversation moved on, leaving me and the rocking chair behind, two relics scheduled for removal. I slowly bent down and began to pick up the scattered laundry, my hands trembling. The smell of fresh linen no longer felt like a comfort. It smelled like a lie. Sunday dinner had always been Richard's favorite meal of the week. He believed it was sacred, a time to put everything else aside and just be a family. The smell of roast chicken would fill the house for hours, a warm, savory promise of comfort and connection. Tonight, the chicken was roasting. The smell was the same, but the promise was broken. The comfort was gone. The air in the dining room was thick with a silence so cold it felt like it could shatter. I sat at the head of the long oak table, in the same chair I had always occupied. But tonight, it didn't feel like a position of honor. It felt like an island. Far at the other end, Michael and Sarah sat close together, their chairs angled towards each other, creating a private, impenetrable fortress. They were speaking in low murmurs, their words too soft for me to hear, but their body language was a shout. They were a unit. I was the outsider. I had spent the afternoon helping to prepare the meal out of habit, but Sarah had shadowed my every move, subtly taking over. "Oh, let me get that, Eleanor. It's too heavy," she'd say, taking the roasting pan from my hands. "I have a new recipe for the gravy I want to try," she'd announce, nudging me away from the stove. I was being politely, systematically demoted from the head of the household to a guest with no real purpose. Now, as Michael carved the chicken, the only sounds were the scrape of the knife against the platter and the clinking of our silverware. He placed a slice of breast meat on my plate, along with a scoop of mashed potatoes and some green beans. He did it all without a word, without looking at me. It was the mechanical service of a reluctant waiter. We ate. Or rather, they ate. I pushed the food around my plate. The chicken, which should have been juicy and flavorful, tasted like cardboard. The creamy mashed potatoes felt like glue in my mouth. Every bite was an effort, a struggle to swallow past the lump of sorrow in my throat. Michael ate with a frantic, desperate energy, his eyes fixed on his plate. He wasn't tasting the food. He was inhaling it. He was trying to finish as quickly as possible, to escape the crushing weight of the silence, to escape my presence. Each hurried bite was a testament to his cowardice. Halfway through the meal, Sarah put her fork down with a delicate clink. She took a sip of her water and looked at Michael, but she pitched her voice just loud enough for me to hear clearly. "My friend Jenna was just telling me about her parents' house," she began, her tone light and conversational. She said they have so much stuff, decades of it, just collecting dust. She says it's so much better to live a minimalist lifestyle. Less to clean, less to worry about. It's just so freeing. There it was, a perfectly aimed dart, disguised as a casual observation. It wasn't about Jenna's parents. It was about me. It was about Richard's rocking chair, about the photos on the wall, about the little trinkets and books that held the story of my life. She was calling my memories stuff. She was calling my life clutter. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Michael, waiting, pleading with my eyes for him to say something, to defend me, to defend the life his father and I had built. He could have said anything. Oh, I don't know, I kind of like having memories around. Or even just, please pass the salt. Anything to break the spell of her cruelty. He did nothing. He just kept eating, his fork scraping against his plate a little louder now. He didn't even flinch. His silence was his consent. He was agreeing with her. I looked down at my plate. The green beans were cold. The gravy on the potatoes was starting to congeal. The golden brown chicken skin looked greasy under the dim yellow light of the dining room chandelier. The whole meal, once a symbol of warmth and family, now seemed rotten. I felt invisible, like a ghost at my own table. I could have stood up and screamed, and I don't think they would have noticed. They were in their own world, a world they were building on the foundations of mine, a world where I had no place. The beautiful oak table that had hosted countless birthdays, holidays, and laughter-filled meals now felt as vast and empty as a desert. I was completely and utterly alone. The dawn was cold and sharp. A delicate layer of frost covered every blade of grass in the backyard, making the whole world look like it was dusted with sugar and glass. I pulled my old, worn wool sweater tighter around my shoulders, my breath pluming in the still air. This was my sanctuary, this garden. Richard and I had designed it together, planting each bush, laying each stone path with our own hands. Out here, surrounded by the sleeping roses and the quiet dignity of the old oak tree, I could almost pretend that nothing had changed. I picked up my pruning shears from the small wooden bench. Their metal was icy cold against my skin. The familiar weight in my hand was reassuring. Pruning the roses was a ritual, a conversation I continued to have with my husband. He always said that you had to cut back the old, dead wood to make way for new growth. A metaphor for life, he'd call it, with a wink. The irony of it all felt like a physical weight on my chest. I moved from bush to bush, my movements slow and deliberate. Snip! A dead branch fell to the frosty ground. Snip! Another. I focused on the task, on the clean, satisfying sound of the shears. I was trying to impose a little bit of order on a world that had spun completely out of my control. Here, at least, I could decide what stayed and what had to go. The memories were thick in the air. I remembered the summer Michael, at age 10, tried to build a treehouse in the old oak and ended up with a sprained wrist. I remembered the countless barbecues, the smell of charcoal mingling with the sweet scent of Richard's prize-winning roses. This garden wasn't just dirt and plants. It was a living archive of our family, of our love. Each rose bush was a testament to a life well lived, a life that was now being systematically dismantled from the inside out. I was trimming a beautiful deep red rose, a variety called Mr. Lincoln that had been Richard's absolute favorite, when a sound from the house sliced through the morning calm. The kitchen window was cracked open, just a sliver, to let out the steam from the coffee maker. And through that sliver came a voice, Sarah's voice. It was low but sharp with an unfamiliar edge of panic. It was a voice stripped of all its syrupy sweetness, raw and frayed with fear. "You have to do something, Michael. You have to do it today." I froze, my shears hovering over a branch. My heart began to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs. I held my breath, straining to hear. I know, I'm trying." Michael's voice was a muffled, defeated rumble. "What do you want me to do, Sarah? Just throw her out on the street?" "Don't be so dramatic," she hissed back, her voice a venomous whisper. "I'm not the bad guy here. Did you even look at the letter? It's a final notice from the bank, Michael. Final. That means they're not playing around anymore. We are out of time. The house is the only thing that can save us now. It's the only asset we have left that's worth anything." The pruning shears slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the stone path. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet garden. The bank. A final notice. The only thing that can save us. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. It wasn't about a clean, modern aesthetic. It wasn't about my memories being clutter. It was about money. They weren't just greedy. They were desperate. They were drowning. And they were willing to push my head under the water to keep themselves afloat. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I leaned against the cold, rough bark of the oak tree for support. The betrayal was so much deeper, so much uglier than I had imagined. They hadn't just pushed me aside for their own comfort. They were sacrificing me to save themselves from a disaster of their own making. They had watched me grieve for my husband. They had sat with me in silence, all while knowing they were about to take the very last thing he and I had built together. I looked at the house, my house. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a prize, a commodity, a life raft they were trying to rip from my hands. And I, the person who had filled it with love and life for 40 years, was just an obstacle, an inconvenience to be removed. The cold morning air felt thin, and I couldn't seem to draw a full breath. The frost on the grass glittered, suddenly looking sharp and hostile. The beautiful red rose I had been about to prune now seemed to mock me, its color as deep and dark as the secret my son and his wife had been hiding. I didn't fight it. After what I'd overheard in the garden, the fight had drained out of me, leaving behind a cold, hollow resignation. On Monday morning, under a sky the color of slate, I found a cardboard box in the garage and brought it up to my bedroom. My bedroom. The last room in the house that still felt like mine. The air was damp and still. I started with the bookshelf. I took down Richard's favorite collection of poetry, the leather covers soft and worn beneath my fingers. I ran my thumb over his name, embossed in gold on the first page. With each book I placed in the box, it felt like I was packing up pieces of him, pieces of us. The box wasn't just filling with paper and ink. It was filling with 40 years of shared stories and quiet evenings. It was the heaviest thing I had ever lifted. On my nightstand, our wedding photograph stood in its silver frame. I picked it up. In the photo, Richard was looking at me, not at the camera, with a love so bright and fierce it felt like it could warm me even now, through the glass. I couldn't bear to look at it. I couldn't bear to see his hopeful, happy face, knowing what was happening to the life he had left in my care. I gently placed it face down on the nightstand. The gesture felt like a final goodbye. That's when the floorboards in the hallway creaked. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. The energy in the room shifted, growing heavy and thick with shame. Michael stood in the doorway. He wasn't the man from the dinner table, hiding behind a newspaper. He wasn't the ghost from the living room, staring at a laptop. This was someone else entirely. He looked terrible, as if he hadn't slept in days. His face was pale and drawn, and dark, bruised-looking circles pooled beneath his eyes. He looked haunted. He looked broken. He just stood there for a long moment, watching me place another book into the box. He leaned against the doorframe, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, as if he were afraid of what they might do if he let them out. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a dry, ragged whisper, a sound scraped from the bottom of his soul. Mom! I stopped, my hand hovering over a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just waited. He cleared his throat, a rough, painful sound. Mom, you need to move out. The words landed in the quiet room with no force, yet they shattered everything. I slowly, very slowly, straightened up and turned to face him. I looked directly at my son, and for the first time, I saw it all. It wasn't malice in his eyes. It wasn't the cold triumph I saw in Sarah's. It was something far worse. It was a hollow, bottomless pit of shame. It was the terrified look of a cornered animal. It was the dead-eyed resignation of a man who knew he was doing something monstrous but was too weak, too broken to stop it. He wasn't a villain. He was a coward. And somehow, that was so much more painful. The man standing before me wasn't the little boy who promised to always take care of me. He wasn't the proud teenager who walked me down the aisle at a cousin's wedding. He wasn't even the ambitious young man Richard had been so proud of. I didn't know this person. This pale, haunted stranger wearing my son's face was someone I had never met before. And in that moment, my heart didn't just break. It disintegrated. It turned to dust. The pain was twofold, a double-edged blade that sliced me in two. I was mourning the loss of my home, the sanctuary Richard and I had built. And I was mourning the loss of my son, the boy I had raised, who was now lost to me forever, drowned in a sea of debt and weakness. He tried to say something else. We'll find you a new place, a nice place. The words were meaningless, empty air. He was offering me a bandage for a mortal wound. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My voice was a prisoner in my own throat. I just stared at him, at this stranger who had stolen my son. I watched the shame flicker in his eyes, watched his jaw clench, watched the unbearable weight of his own actions crush him right there in the doorway of my room. He couldn't hold my gaze. He looked away first, his eyes darting to the floor, to the wall, anywhere but at the wreckage he had created. He mumbled something else, an apology or an excuse, I don't know which. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy and defeated on the old wooden floors. I stood alone in the silence, the half-packed box at my feet, the ghost of my husband all around me, and a hole in my heart so vast and so cold that I knew, with absolute certainty, it would never be filled again. The key felt cold and foreign in my hand. It unlocked the door to apartment 2B. The apartment didn't smell like home. It didn't smell like fresh-cut grass or Richard's coffee or the lemon polish I used on the oak furniture. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale recycled air. It smelled of nothing. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty space. I was surrounded by boxes. Cardboard boxes of all sizes, stacked against beige walls, each one marked in Michael's hurried scrawl. Kitchen, bedroom, books. They looked like tombstones in a sterile, lifeless cemetery. This was it. This was my new life, packed into squares of corrugated paper. I walked to the center of the living room. It was small, a pale imitation of the one I had left. A large window looked out, not onto a garden of rose bushes, but onto a sprawling parking lot dotted with sensible sedans just like mine. Beyond that, another building identical to this one stared back at me. I was anonymous now, just one of 100 identical windows. For a long time, I just stood there, my purse still slung over my shoulder, the cold key still clutched in my fist. I was waiting for the wave of grief to hit, for the tears to finally come, for the screaming rage to boil over. But nothing happened. I felt hollowed out. a fragile shell with nothing inside. The shock had insulated me, wrapping me in a thick, gray numbness. The silence was absolute. It pressed in on me from all sides. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to realize that this silence was different from the one I had endured in my own home. That silence had been tense, a weapon, thick with unspoken resentments and things left unsaid. This silence was just empty. It held no judgment. It held no expectation. It was a blank canvas. My legs began to ache. I spotted a box labeled kitchen, and, with robotic movements, I opened it. I found my blue ceramic teapot, the one with the chip on the spout. It had survived the journey. I found the box of Earl Grey tea bags and a single mug. I filled the pot with water from the strange, unfamiliar tap and set it on the strange, unfamiliar stove. While the water heated, I sat on a sturdy-looking box marked linens. I looked around at the beige walls, the beige carpet, the beige countertops. It was a world devoid of color, devoid of history. It was a place for waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. The kettle whistled, a shrill, piercing sound that made me jump. I made my tea and cradled the warm mug in my hands, letting the steam mist my face. The warmth did little to penetrate the ice in my veins. I felt adrift, unmoored from everything I had ever known, a ghost haunting someone else's empty apartment. I couldn't just sit here. I couldn't let the beige walls swallow me whole. I needed to do something, anything, to feel real again. My eyes landed on the box I was sitting on. Linens. With a sigh, I put my mug down and sliced the packing tape with my house key. I folded back the cardboard flaps. On top, nestled in tissue paper, was the old knitted Afghan Richard's mother had made for us as a wedding gift. It was a riot of color, deep blues, warm golds, and rich forest greens. I lifted it from the box. It was heavy, substantial. It smelled faintly of cedar from the chest it was always stored in. It smelled like home, like real home. My hands were trembling as I unfolded it. I wrapped it around my shoulders, the familiar weight of it a sudden grounding pressure. I pulled the soft, thick wool up to my chin and closed my eyes. And that's when it happened. A single, shuddering breath escaped my lips. A breath I didn't realize I had been holding for days, for weeks. I breathed in again, deeply, filling my lungs with the stale, recycled air of the apartment. But this time, it didn't feel so suffocating. The silence in the room hadn't changed, but my perception of it had. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of solitude. It was the silence of peace. There were no footsteps to listen for, no passive-aggressive comments to brace for, no heavy sighs of disappointment from across the room. No one was watching me. No one was judging me. For the first time since Richard died, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. The tears finally came then. Not the hot, angry tears of betrayal, but quiet, salty tears of profound, aching loneliness. They streamed down my face, soaking into the collar of my shirt. But as I sat there, wrapped in a blanket of memories, a tiny, fragile thought pushed its way through the grief. I could survive this. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be the life I had planned. But in this quiet, lonely, beige room, I was safe. I was alone, but I was also, finally, free. For 2 weeks, the beige walls of my apartment were my entire world. I unpacked my boxes, arranged my few belongings, and established a quiet, lonely routine. But the silence, which had at first felt like a peaceful refuge, began to feel like a prison. I was starving for a real human voice, for a conversation that wasn't just in my own head. A flyer taped inside the elevator announced a Saturday social hour in the community common room with coffee and pastries. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers made my stomach clench with anxiety. But the thought of another day spent talking to myself was even worse. So, I put on my nicest sweater, took a deep breath, and forced myself to go. The common room was bright and noisy, a stark contrast to my silent apartment. The air smelled of strong coffee and cinnamon. People were gathered in small groups, chatting and laughing. It felt like a party I hadn't been invited to. I felt every bit the newcomer, an awkward outsider hovering by the door. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hand trembling slightly, and found an empty chair in a corner, planning to make a quick escape as soon as I finished my cup. That's when she appeared. "Is this seat taken?" a cheerful voice asked. I looked up to see a woman smiling down at me. She was younger than most of the residents, probably in her early 50s, with a stylish haircut and a bright, energetic aura. "No, please," I managed to say. "I'm Brenda," she said, sitting down with a plate holding a large cinnamon roll. "I haven't seen you around before. You must be new." Her smile was dazzling. One of those perfect, toothy smiles you see in toothpaste commercials. It was almost too bright. "Eleanor," I said. "Yes, I just moved in a couple of weeks ago." "Well, welcome to the madhouse," she laughed. "It's a good group here mostly. You just have to avoid George when he starts talking politics." She leaned in conspiratorially. "So what brings you to our humble abode?" There was something about her, an easy, disarming warmth that made it feel safe to talk. I hadn't intended to say anything, but the words just started to tumble out. I gave her the short version, of course. I told her my husband had recently passed away, and that I decided to downsize, to move somewhere smaller and easier to manage. I left out the part about the new lock on the door and the suitcase in the rain. Brenda listened with an expression of intense, focused empathy. She nodded in all the right places, her brow furrowed with concern. She even reached out and gave my hand a comforting squeeze. "Oh, you poor thing," she said when I finished. "To lose your husband and then have to go through the stress of a move all at once. That's just awful. You are one strong woman." No one had called me strong. I felt like the weakest person on earth. Hearing her say it made a lump form in my throat. "It hasn't been easy," I admitted, my voice thick. "I can only imagine," she said, her voice soft. "Family is so important at a time like this. I hope your children have been a good support for you." And that was all it took. The dam broke. I told her everything. I told her about Michael and Sarah, about the rocking chair, about the dinner, about the final soul-crushing conversation in my bedroom. The story poured out of me in a torrent of whispered, painful words. I couldn't stop it. Brenda never interrupted. She just listened, her eyes full of what looked like genuine compassion. When I finally fell silent, exhausted and a little horrified at how much I had revealed to a perfect stranger, she shook her head slowly. "Oh, Eleanor," she sighed. "That's a tough situation. A really tough one." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You know, sometimes when people are grieving, and when there's money and property involved, things get messy. People say and do things they don't mean. They get scared." She leaned closer. "I'm sure your son loves you very much. He's probably just in over his head. And his wife. Well, sometimes we women can get a little carried away when we're trying to build a nest." She smiled a little, as if sharing a secret between us. "But you can't throw away a lifetime of love over one terrible mistake. At the end of the day, family is all we have. It's the only thing that really matters. Maybe it's all just water under the bridge, you know?" Water under the bridge. The phrase sounded so simple, so reasonable. Her words were like a soothing balm on a raw wound. She wasn't taking sides. She was offering understanding. She was offering hope. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of warmth spread through my chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe Michael was just scared. Maybe it was all a horrible, grief-fueled misunderstanding. The thought was intoxicating. As I left the common room a little while later, my empty coffee cup in hand, I felt lighter than I had in ages. I felt seen. I felt understood. Brenda had given me a gift. The possibility of a different story. One where I wasn't a victim, but a mother who could choose to forgive. On a table by the exit, a pot of bright yellow chrysanthemums bloomed, their cheerful faces turned towards the light. I smiled. For the first time, I thought that maybe, just maybe, things could be fixed. Brenda's words had planted a seed of hope in the barren soil of my heart, and for the next few days, I tended to it carefully. I replayed our conversation in my mind. People do things they don't mean. He's probably just in over his head. Water under the bridge. The phrases became a mantra, a fragile shield against the cold reality of my situation. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that this nightmare might have an end, that my family wasn't lost to me forever. So when the knock came on my apartment door that afternoon, I wasn't filled with the usual dread. I felt a flicker of nervous anticipation. I opened the door, and there they were, Michael and Sarah. They looked completely different. The tension was gone from Michael's shoulders. The smug superiority was gone from Sarah's face. They looked tired, yes, but also remorseful. Michael was holding a bakery box, the kind they use for pies, and Sarah was holding a bouquet of bright yellow chrysanthemums, just like the ones I'd seen in the common room. The gesture was so on the nose, it should have been a red flag, but I was too blinded by hope to see it. "Mom," Michael said, his voice soft. Can we come in for a minute?" "Of course," I said, stepping back to let them pass. They entered the small apartment, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. "It's cozy," Sarah said, placing the flowers on my small kitchen counter. She managed to make the word sound like an insult. "We brought you a pie," Michael said, setting the box on my tiny dining table. "Apple. I remember it was always your favorite." He remembered. A small, simple detail, but it felt monumental. My heart swelled. Brenda was right. He did love me. He did remember. "Thank you, Michael. That's very thoughtful," I said, my voice genuine. They sat on my small sofa, perched awkwardly on the edge of the cushions. I sat in the armchair opposite them. For a moment, we were all silent. Michael broke it first. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, and he finally looked me in the eye. "Mom, we're so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've been acting like monsters. I haven't been myself since Dad died. Grief does crazy things to people. I let things get out of hand. I let Sarah..." He glanced at his wife. Sarah picked up her cue perfectly. "I've been terrible, Eleanor. Truly. I was so worried about Michael, so wrapped up in everything. I wasn't thinking clearly. The things I said, the way I acted. There's no excuse. We miss you. The house isn't the same without you." It was everything I had been secretly hoping to hear. Every word was a soothing balm on my bruised heart. I wanted to believe them so desperately that I didn't question a thing. I just nodded, my eyes filling with tears of relief. "We want to make it right," Michael continued, pressing his advantage. "We want you to come home. Not for good, just for dinner tomorrow night. So we can talk properly, as a family, no decorators, no distractions. We need to fix this. I I started. My voice choked. I'd like that very much. A wave of relief washed over their faces. Sarah's smile was wide and bright. Oh, that's wonderful, she exclaimed. Let me just text Brenda and tell her the good news. She's been so worried about you. She reached for her purse but then paused. Actually, would you mind if I used your restroom first? Of course not, dear. It's just down the hall, I said. As she stood up, she left her phone on the coffee table. Careless, overconfident. I'll put the kettle on, I said, my voice light with happiness. A cup of tea felt like the perfect way to seal this truce. A new beginning. I stood up and walked the few steps to my small kitchen counter. As I filled the kettle with water, a soft buzz came from the coffee table behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, not meaning to pry. It was just a reflex, but my eyes caught the screen as it lit up, and the world stopped. It was a text message. The sender's name at the top of the screen was Brenda. Beneath it, the preview of the message was stark and clear against the bright screen. Just stick to the plan. She's softening up. I think she's about to agree to sign. The kettle in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The cheerful whistle I was anticipating now seemed like a scream of warning. Stick to the plan. Agree to sign. The hope in my chest didn't just vanish. It curdled. It turned to a solid block of ice that spread through my veins, freezing me in place. In that single, horrifying instant, everything became clear. It was a performance. All of it. The apologetic faces, the apple pie, Michael's soft voice, Sarah's tears. It was a carefully rehearsed play, and I was the unsuspecting audience. And Brenda, kind, empathetic Brenda, with her comforting words and her stories about family. She wasn't a friend. She was a Judas goat, leading me to the slaughter. I stood with my back to them, my hand gripping the counter to keep myself from falling. The water was in the kettle. The tea bags were on the counter. The perfect little scene of reconciliation was set. I had to turn around. I had to walk back into that room and face them. I had to pretend I hadn't seen a thing and serve tea to the people who were trying to destroy me. I placed the teacups on the coffee table with a hand that did not shake. The clink of ceramic against wood was the only sound in the room. Inside, my heart was a frozen, jagged stone. But on the outside, I was the picture of a gentle, forgiving mother. I had learned in the last 5 minutes that I was a much better actor than they were. I sat back down in my armchair, the one opposite the sofa where they sat, a matched set of predators waiting for their prey to walk into the trap. I picked up my own teacup, letting the warmth seep into my cold fingers. I met their expectant gazes with a soft, placid smile. The ball was in their court. So, I said, my voice even, it was good of you to come. Michael took the opening, leaning forward earnestly. Of course, Mom. We had to. We couldn't let things stay the way they were. This whole thing, it's been a nightmare. A nightmare, I repeated softly, taking a sip of tea. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Exactly, Sarah chimed in, her voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. And we know it's been hardest on you. We want to fix it. We want our family back. She reached over and placed her hand on Michael's knee, a perfect portrait of a supportive wife. It was all for my benefit, a carefully staged play. And how do you propose we fix it? I asked, my curiosity genuine. I truly wanted to see how far they would take this lie. Well, Michael said, clearing his throat. First, you come home. We'll have that dinner tomorrow night, and we'll just talk, clear the air, and then we can figure out the logistics. Logistics? I asked it, raising an eyebrow. This was the part they had rehearsed. Michael glanced at Sarah. who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Yeah, you know, he said, trying to sound casual. The house. The title is still in your and Dad's name, in the trust. It's all a bit complicated. Our lawyer said it would be much simpler for tax purposes and everything if we just streamlined it, put it in our names. It would make it easier for us to manage the property taxes, the upkeep, all the things you shouldn't have to worry about anymore. There it was, the hook, hidden beneath layers of fake concern and legal jargon. Agree to sign. The words from Brenda's text message echoed in my mind. They thought I was a foolish old woman, addled by grief, who would gratefully sign away her entire life for the price of an apple pie and a few crocodile tears. They had profoundly underestimated me. I set my teacup down in its saucer. The small sound seemed to echo in the tense silence. I looked at them, at their hopeful, greedy faces. The ice in my heart wasn't melting. It was hardening into something sharp, something strong. Steel. I let the silence stretch, watching them squirm. Michael shifted on the cushion. Sarah's perfect smile began to twitch at the edges. Finally, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of my newfound certainty. That's very thoughtful of you both, I said, but it won't be necessary. I paused. I'm happy here. The words landed in the room like stones, shattering their carefully constructed fantasy. Michael's face fell, confusion warring with frustration. Sarah's mask of sweetness dissolved completely, replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered anger. What? Michael stammered. What do you mean, you're happy here? Mom, this is a tiny apartment. Your whole life is in that house. My life is right here, I said, gesturing vaguely to the room around me. It's quiet. It's peaceful. It's mine. The frustration won. Michael's face flushed a dark, ugly red. He shot to his feet, his own teacup rattling on the table. Happy here? He spat, his voice rising. After everything we've done to try and make this right? After we came here to apologize? How can you be so selfish? Selfish. The accusation hung in the air, vibrating with his rage. A week ago, that word would have destroyed me. It would have sent me spiraling into guilt and self-doubt. But now, it was just a word, a hollow, meaningless sound. Because now, I knew the truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I didn't even flinch. I just looked up at my furious, flustered son, this stranger who was shouting at me, and I felt a profound, chilling sense of pity. I held his gaze, my own calm and unwavering. I let the silence after his outburst settle, letting his accusation hang in the air like a foul smell. Then I asked a simple question, my voice as soft and as sharp as a shard of ice. Selfishness, I said slowly, is when a person thinks only of themselves, no matter the cost to others. Isn't that right, Michael? The color drained from his face as if a plug had been pulled. His mouth opened, then closed again. He had no answer. Sarah stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and dawning horror, finally understanding that the game was over and they had lost. The teacup sat on the table between us, cold and forgotten. The silence that followed was absolute, and in it, for the first time in a very long time, I was the one in control. Mr. Hayes's office was a time capsule. It was filled with the scent of old books, lemon polish, and the quiet dignity of the law. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes that looked as old as the state itself. Mr. Hayes had been our family lawyer for 30 years. He had drawn up the original trust for the house with Richard, celebrated with us when we paid off the mortgage, and just a few weeks ago, he had handled Richard's will with gentle, somber professionalism. He looked at me over the top of his spectacles, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. Eleanor, he said, his voice calm and measured. Are you absolutely certain about this? This is an irrevocable step. Once you sign these papers, there's no going back. I looked at the stack of documents neatly arranged on the polished mahogany of his desk. They were thick and important looking, filled with dense legal language, but their meaning was simple. They were my declaration of independence. I am more certain of this, Arthur, than I have been of anything in a very long time, I said. My voice didn't waver. The woman who had trembled on her own porch, who had cried in a sterile apartment, was gone. In her place was someone I was just getting to know, someone made of sterner stuff. He sighed, a soft, weary sound. I understand you're hurt. What your son and his wife have done is unconscionable. But to give away the house entirely? It's the sum total of your and Richard's life's work. It's your legacy. No, I corrected him gently. My legacy is not a building of wood and brick. Richard and I thought it was, but we were wrong. I leaned forward slightly. My legacy is how I choose to live the rest of my life. And I choose not to live it as a victim. I choose not to let my home, our home, become a monument to their greed and my sorrow. I pointed to the main document, the deed of gift. That is why the clause is so important to me. Mr. Hayes picked up the paper, reading the specific clause again, as if to be sure. The installation of a permanent brass plaque, measuring no less than 8 by 10 inches on the front of the house, bearing the name, The Haven Project. He looked at me. It's an unusual request, Eleanor. It's a necessary one, I said. I don't want this to be a quiet transaction. I want the truth to have a voice. Every time someone walks down that street, every time a neighbor drives by, every single time Michael and Sarah pass that house, I want them to see that sign. I want them to be reminded of what they did. And I want them to know that something good came from it. Not for them, for people like me, people who have been cast aside. That sign isn't for revenge, Arthur. It's for justice. He studied my face for a long moment, and whatever he was looking for, he must have found it. He gave a slow, decisive nod. Very well. He pushed the papers towards me. First, the deed of gift. I picked up the heavy fountain pen he offered. The nib scratched softly against the thick, creamy paper as I signed my name, Eleanor Vance. It looked strong. It looked final. Next, he produced the amendment to my will. It was a simple document. It stated that all my remaining personal assets, my savings, my car, the contents of my apartment, were to be left to a charity for animal welfare, a cause Richard had always supported. All except for one item. And for my son, Michael Vance. Mr. Hayes read aloud. I leave the family photo album currently in my possession in the hopes that it will remind him of what he once had. That was it. I wasn't leaving him with nothing. I was leaving him with everything. I was leaving him with the tangible proof of the family he had shattered, the love he had thrown away. I was leaving him with the memories he had decided were less valuable than a piece of property. It was a far heavier burden than any amount of money. I signed that document too. My hand was steady. A woman I didn't know, a notary, stepped forward. She checked my signature, asked me to confirm my identity, and then, with a satisfying, definitive thud, she embossed the papers with her official seal. It was done. A wave of feeling washed over me, so powerful it almost made me dizzy. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't glee. It was release. A 40-year weight I didn't even know I was carrying. The weight of being a wife, a mother, a caretaker, the keeper of the house, the keeper of the peace, had just been lifted from my shoulders. I felt light. I felt clean. I felt a profound, bone-deep sense of peace that was entirely my own. I stood up and extended my hand to Mr. Hayes. "Thank you, Arthur, for everything." He took my hand, his grip firm and respectful. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor," he said. I walked out of his office, leaving the signed papers and the ghost of my old life behind me. The sun was bright in the afternoon sky. I didn't know where I was going next, not exactly. But for the first time, it didn't matter, because wherever I went, I would be going as myself, whole and complete, the sole author of my own story. And that was a home no one could ever take away from me. Spring arrived that year not as a gentle suggestion, but as a bold, confident declaration. The sun felt warm on my face, and a soft breeze, carrying the sweet scent of lilac from a neighbor's bush, rustled the leaves of the small maple tree I had planted outside my patio. I sat in my old wooden rocking chair, the one I had insisted on taking with me, letting its familiar rhythmic creak soothe me. In my hands, I held my favorite blue ceramic mug, filled with hot tea. It was perfect. This small concrete patio, with its 2 pots of cheerful red geraniums and its view of the parking lot, had become more of a home to me than the grand house ever was in those last few weeks. Home, I had learned, wasn't a place with 4 walls and a roof. It wasn't a collection of furniture or a manicured lawn. Home was a feeling. It was peace. It was the quiet, unshakable certainty that you belong to yourself. I took a sip of my tea and thought, for a fleeting moment, of Michael and Sarah. I didn't feel the hot sting of anger anymore, nor the cold ache of betrayal. What I felt instead was a profound, distant pity. I pictured them in my mind, not as monsters, but as 2 desperate people who had made a terrible bargain. They had traded their integrity for a house, their humanity for a solution to their debts. They had tried to steal my home, and in the process, they had lost their own souls. I hoped, for their sake, that they would one day find their way back. But their journey was no longer my own. I had finally let go. The dust had settled, and I was free. My world was here now, in the warmth of the sun, the taste of my tea, the friendships I was slowly building with the other residents. I had joined a book club. I was volunteering at the local animal shelter twice a week, just as Richard and I had always talked about doing. My life was small, yes, but it was rich, and it was mine. Every single piece of it. The air in their cramped, 1-bedroom apartment was stale and thick with resentment. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a sickly yellow light on the peeling paint and the stacks of unopened boxes. It smelled of damp carpet and desperation. Sarah stood by the grimy window, staring down at the alleyway below. "This is all your fault," she said, her voice low and venomous. "All of it." Michael sat at a wobbly kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper in his hands. It was the official eviction notice from the Haven Project, printed on crisp, professional letterhead. The words were polite, but the meaning was brutal. They had 30 days. "My fault?" he shot back, his voice cracking. "I seem to recall you being the one whispering in my ear every single day. The house is the only thing that can save us, Michael. You have to be strong, Michael. This was your plan, Sarah. Your brilliant plan. My plan was for you to get your mother to sign a piece of paper," she shrieked, whirling around to face him. Her face was pale and drawn. "My plan wasn't for you to be so weak, so pathetic, that you drove her to give the entire thing away. A charity, Michael. She gave our house to a charity for abandoned old people. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" "I know how humiliating it is," he yelled, slamming his fist on the table. The flimsy table shuddered. "I saw the sign. They put a big, shiny brass sign right on the front of the house. I have to see it every time I drive by. My friends see it. They ask me about it. So what are we going to do? Sarah demanded, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. The bank is still calling. The credit card companies. We are completely sunk. We have nothing. Michael slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked down at his hands, the hands of a man who had lost everything. He had lost his father, his mother, his home, and his self-respect. He had made the deal, and now the devil had come to collect. I don't know, he said, his voice hollow. I don't know. I rocked back and forth, the gentle motion a quiet rhythm for my thoughts. I had come to understand that Richard hadn't left me a house. He had left me something far more valuable. He had left me his strength. The strength to endure, the strength to let go, and the strength to build something new from the ashes of the old. I looked out past my small patio, past the parking lot, towards the open sky. My old life had been a story written by two people. This new life, this was a story written by one, and for the first time, I held the pen. I was the author, and I couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.